At 57, Steffi Graf does not look like someone chasing the past. That may be the first thing people notice. Not because she has disappeared completely. She hasn't. Every now and then, there is a photo, a charity appearance, a tennis-related event, a quiet public moment beside Andre Agassi. But there is something different about the way she exists in public now. She does not seem to be asking for attention. And maybe that is what makes people stop. Because for anyone who remembers tennis in the late 1980s and 1990s, Steffi Graf was not just a champion. She was almost a measurement of excellence, a standard, a name people said when they meant discipline, speed, silence, pressure, perfection. 22 Grand Slam singles titles, a Golden Slam in 1988, 377 weeks as world number one. Those numbers are real. They are not decoration. They are part of the record. But numbers also have a strange way of hiding the person inside them. Because when people say Steffi Graf won everything, they sometimes forget to ask what it felt like to be the woman who was expected to win everything. And that is where this story begins. Not in Mannheim, where she was born, not on a practice court with a racket in her hand as a child, not even at Wimbledon, where the applause seemed to follow her like weather. It begins much later. It begins with the quiet, recent calm image of Steffi Graf, not overly dramatic, soft background, no hospital imagery, no fake sadness. If you have followed Steffi from the old days, you may have noticed this too. There are legends who retire and keep returning to the spotlight, because the spotlight is the only home they ever really knew. They commentate, they tour, they sell the old glory again and again. There is nothing wrong with that, but Steffi chose something else. Or at least from the outside, that is what it looks like. She chose distance, privacy, family, charity work, controlled appearances, a life where she could be present without being consumed. And I think that is why seeing her now can feel unexpectedly emotional. Not because something terrible has been confirmed, it hasn't. Not because there is some hidden tragedy that suddenly explains everything, but because time itself has done what no opponent could do. It has changed the picture. For years, the public remembered her moving like a blade across the baseline, fast, clean, almost unreadable. That famous forehand did not feel like a shot as much as a verdict. The point was over before the viewer had finished understanding it. But now, when people see her at 57, the reaction is different. You are not seeing the young champion in the white dress at Wimbledon. You are seeing the woman who survived being that champion. There is a difference. And it matters. Because Steffi Graf was never the loudest superstar in the room. Even during her greatest years, she did not seem hungry for celebrity in the way some athletes are. Her game was expressive. Her public personality was often contained, almost guarded. At the time, that made her seem mysterious. Looking back, it may have been protection. That is only an interpretation, of course. We cannot pretend to know what she felt behind closed doors. But when someone spends their youth being watched, judged, photographed, praised, questioned, and measured almost every week of the year, privacy does not look like emptiness anymore. It looks like oxygen. And maybe that is the part many people missed. The tragedy of Steffi Graf, if we can even use that word carefully, is not that she lost everything. She didn't. She built a life. She married Andre Agassi in 2001. She became a mother. She stepped into philanthropic work, most notably through Children for Tomorrow, the foundation she created to help children and families affected by war, persecution, and organized violence. According to the foundation itself, that work began in 1998, before she had even fully left the sport behind. Think about that for a moment. At a time when most people still saw her as a tennis machine, she was already putting energy into children whose pain had nothing to do with trophies, rankings, or center court applause. That detail at the time may not have looked like the center of her story, but now it feels important. Because perhaps Steffi understood something early. Winning could not be the only answer. And maybe after so many years of being asked about matches, opponents, injuries, and records, she wanted her life to mean something that did not require a scoreboard. Still, there is a sadness in the distance. Not a scandalous sadness, a human one. When a public figure grows older quietly, the audience sometimes feels abandoned. We do not say it that way, but it is there. We want the people who shaped our memories to remain available. We want them to appear when we call them back. We want them to look like the version of themselves we stored away in our minds. Steffi Graf does not offer that comfort completely. She appears, then steps back. She smiles, then disappears again. She gives enough to remind people she is still here, but not enough to let the public own her. And for some viewers, especially those who watched her when they were younger themselves, that can hurt in a quiet way. Because seeing Steffi now is also seeing your own timeline. The years when she dominated tennis were the years when many people were raising children, building marriages, ending marriages, watching weekend sports on television, reading newspapers on Sunday mornings, remembering where they were when the big finals happened. She belongs to that older emotional calendar. So when you see her now, older, calmer, less visible, you are not only asking, what happened to Steffi Graf? You may also be asking something more personal. What happened to the time when she was everywhere? What happened to the version of us who watched her? What happened to the world where athletes did not have to explain themselves every day on social media? And that is why the title of this story can feel heavier than it first appears. What happened to Steffi Graf at 57? The honest answer is not simple. From what is publicly known, she is alive. She is private. She is still connected to sport in selective ways. She is still involved in causes that matter to her. She is still remembered as one of the greatest tennis players who ever lived. But emotionally, something else happened. The woman who once lived under permanent observation seems to have built a life where observation is no longer the point. That may not sound dramatic, but maybe it is more powerful than drama. Because there is a kind of courage in walking away when people still want more from you. There is a kind of grief in realizing that the champion you remember does not belong to the public anymore. And there is a kind of beauty in seeing someone who once carried the weight of perfection finally allowed to be ordinary, or at least as ordinary as Steffi Graf can ever be. The exact reasons for every choice she made are not fully confirmed. Some things are known through interviews, some through public appearances, some through the record, and some things remain private as they probably should, but one pattern is hard to ignore. Steffi Graf did not simply leave tennis. She slowly, carefully, almost quietly, left behind the version of fame that had followed her since childhood. And maybe that is the first real answer. At 57, what happened to Steffi Graf is not that she broke. It is that she stepped out of the frame. And for those who still remember the sound of the crowd when she walked onto center court, that quiet can feel almost heartbreaking. There is something strange about watching old footage of Steffi Graf now. At first, you see the obvious things: the footwork, the speed, the forehand, that small, controlled expression after a winner, as if even joy had to remain disciplined. She did not celebrate like someone trying to prove herself to the crowd. She often looked as if she was already thinking about the next point. And maybe that is why people called her cold sometimes. Not cruel, not distant in a careless way, just hard to read. But when you look again, years later, it feels different. You begin to wonder whether what people called coldness was actually survival. By 1988, Steffi Graf was only 19 years old, and yet the tennis world was already asking adult things from her. That year became almost impossible to explain without sounding exaggerated, even when you are only stating facts. She won the Australian Open, the French Open, Wimbledon, the US Open, and then Olympic gold in Seoul, the Golden Slam. A phrase that sounds clean, almost beautiful. But imagine being 19 and having the world decide that anything less than perfection from that point forward would feel like decline. That is the part records do not say out loud, because after a person reaches something no one else has reached, the public rarely asks, "Are you tired?" It asks, "Can you do it again?" And Steffi did keep doing it, not the Golden Slam again, because that kind of year belongs almost outside normal sport. But she kept winning, she kept returning, she kept carrying that quiet expectation that, if she was on the court, control was supposed to belong to her. If you watched her back then, you may remember the feeling. A Graf match did not always feel like a drama. Sometimes it felt like weather moving in. The opponent could be talented, brave, prepared, and still, at some point, Steffi's rhythm would begin to close around the match. The slice backhand would stay low, the forehand would arrive suddenly, The legs would not stop, and the face barely changed. That face became part of the legend, but it may also have trapped her. At the time, the sports media loved simple labels: power player, ice champion, German machine. They did not always know what to do with a young woman who was not trying to entertain them emotionally. She did not give them endless confession. She did not turn every press conference into theater. So the silence became a story people could fill in for themselves. Some saw strength, some saw distance, some probably missed the human being completely. That happens to athletes who win too much. Their excellence becomes a wall. People stop imagining their pain because the scoreboard keeps saying they are fine. But the body was not always fine. Over the years, there were injuries, surgeries, long recoveries, and moments when the clean image of dominance became harder to maintain. By the late 1990s, the game had changed too. Younger players were arriving with different power, different noise, different energy. Monica Seles had already changed the emotional temperature of women's tennis. Martina Hingis brought another kind of intelligence. Venus Williams was rising with a new physical force. Steffi was still Steffi. But time had started asking questions, and maybe the most revealing moment did not come in a final. It came near the end in 1999 when she spoke about retirement. She did not create a grand farewell performance. She did not drag the public through a long goodbye. According to reports from that moment, after Wimbledon, she said she was not having fun anymore. She had done what she wanted to do in tennis. She no longer felt the same motivation to fly to tournaments. That sounds simple, but it is not. Because for a champion like Steffi Graf, saying, "I am not having fun anymore," may be one of the most honest things she ever gave the public. Not dramatic, not polished, just tired. And if you are older now, you understand that sentence differently than you might have understood it in 1999. When you are young, you hear it as an athlete retiring. When you have lived longer, you hear something else. You hear a person admitting that the life everyone admired had become too heavy to continue. The exact emotional weight of those final months is not something we can fully know. Only Steffi knows what it felt like inside her own body, inside her own marriage to the sport, inside the pressure that had followed her since childhood. But we can observe the pattern. A girl becomes a prodigy becomes a champion becomes a standard, and then the standard becomes a cage. That may be the quiet sadness here, not that Steffi Graf failed. She succeeded so completely that the world almost forgot she had the right to stop. Some parts of Steffi Graf's story are difficult to talk about because they do not belong only to her. That is where people often make mistakes. They turn pain into a weapon. They turn history into a simple villain and victim story. They act as if every difficult moment has one clear meaning, one clean explanation, one person who carried all of it. But real life is rarely that tidy. And in Steffi's case, one of the heaviest shadows around her career came from something she did not cause, did not ask for, and could never fully escape. April 30th, 1993. Hamburg, Germany. Monica Seles was playing Magdalena Malieva at the Citizen Cup when a man came from the stands and attacked her during a changeover. According to reports from the time, the attacker was obsessed with Steffi Graf. That detail became attached to Steffi's name in a way that was deeply unfair, but also impossible for the public to ignore. And this is where we have to be careful. Steffi was not responsible for that act. Monica was the victim. The attacker was responsible. But the emotional atmosphere around women's tennis changed after that day, and Steffi had to keep walking into a world that now carried a wound no match could repair. If you watched tennis back then, you may remember how strange the years after that felt. Seles had been changing the sport. She was young, fierce, loud in her own way, and already had the kind of presence that made every rivalry feel larger. Then suddenly, the rivalry was broken by something outside sport, not a loss, not an injury from competition, something darker. And Steffi continued winning. That is the uncomfortable part many people do not know how to hold with maturity. She continued, because that is what athletes do. The tour continued, tournaments continued, rankings continued, the machine kept moving. But did it feel the same? We cannot know exactly how Steffi carried that. She has never turned that period into a public emotional performance. She did not build a career on explaining herself. But looking back, it is hard to imagine that the silence around it was empty. Sometimes silence is not cold. Sometimes silence is a person refusing to turn someone else's trauma into her own stage. That is only my reading, of course. Others may see it differently. What happened next depends on who you ask and on what part of the story they lived closest to. For Monica Seles, the damage was direct and life-changing. For Steffi Graf, the shadow was different, more indirect, more complicated. A reminder that fame can attract things no athlete can control. And maybe that is one reason Steffi's public distance later in life feels more understandable. Because by the time she retired, she had not only lived through trophies and applause, she had lived through the strange moral pressure of being near stories that were never simple. There were other pressures too. Her father, Peter Graf, had been a powerful figure in her career from the beginning. He was part of the machinery that shaped her discipline, her ambition, her early rise. To the public, that kind of family involvement often looks inspiring at first. A parent believes, a child works, the world applauds. But behind many prodigies there is a question people ask too late. Where does guidance end and pressure begin? The exact emotional reality of that relationship belongs to Steffi. Outsiders should not pretend to know what happened at the breakfast table, in the car after a loss, or in the quiet hours between tournaments. But we can see the pattern around many young champions. The childhood becomes a schedule. The family becomes part of the business. The body belongs to training. And privacy becomes something postponed until later. For Steffi, later finally came. That may be why her life after tennis feels less like disappearance and more like recovery. Not recovery from one single event, not some dramatic collapse, more like a long return to herself after years of being defined by result sheets, headlines, expectations, and other people's interpretations. And maybe that is what makes her story so emotional now. At 57, she is not asking us to solve her. She is not offering a confession. She is not giving the world a dramatic final answer. She is simply living beyond the noise. And for a woman who spent so many years being watched from every angle, that quiet may be the most honest ending she could choose. Not complete, not explained, but hers. There is a kind of fame that never really ends. Even when the person walks away from the arena, even when the trophies stop arriving, even when the cameras move on to younger faces, something remains. A name, a memory, a picture people refuse to update. Steffi Graf has lived with that for a long time. At 57, she is not only a former tennis champion, she is also a woman standing in the strange space between public memory and private life. Millions of people remember her as if she still belongs to a certain moment. Wimbledon grass, white clothing, focused eyes. That forehand cutting through the court like it already knew the answer. But the woman herself moved on, and that is where the emotion begins. Because Steffi Graf did not give the world the kind of ending people often expect from legends. There was no constant return to explain the old victories, no endless public confession, no repeated attempt to prove that she was still the same woman people remembered. She did something quieter. She stepped away, not all at once, not in a dramatic way, not as if she slammed a door and never looked back, but gradually, carefully, almost deliberately, she built a life where tennis was no longer the center of every conversation. And for someone who had been watched since childhood, that choice may have meant more than people realized. After her retirement in 1999, Steffi did not become a permanent television personality. She did not turn her past into a constant performance. She appeared at certain events, supported causes, stayed connected to tennis in selective ways, but she never seemed desperate to remain visible. That matters, because visibility had already taken so much of her life. From the outside, people often think fame is mostly applause. They see the trophies, the magazine covers, the standing ovations, the center court moments. But fame is also repetition. Questions, expectations, strangers deciding they understand you, commentators discussing your body, your mood, your family, your future. For Steffi, the public had watched almost everything that could be measured. Her wins, her losses, her injuries, her father's influence, her rivalries, her silence. Even her quietness became something people tried to interpret. So perhaps, after all of that, privacy was not withdrawal. Perhaps it was recovery. In 2001, she married Andre Agassi. On paper, that sounds like a perfect sports story. Two tennis icons, both Grand Slam champions, both carrying their own complicated history with fame. But real life is never as simple as a headline. Andre was more open, more restless in the public eye, especially later when he spoke and wrote about his struggles. Steffi remained more reserved. Two people from the same world, but not the same way of surviving it. And maybe that contrast is part of why their life together has interested people for so many years. He often seemed like someone who had to speak in order to process what happened to him. She often seemed like someone who protected what mattered by not saying too much. Neither way is necessarily better. They are just different ways of carrying a past. Their family life was mostly kept away from the constant glare. That detail can sound ordinary now, but it is not. For two people as famous as Steffi Graf and Andre Agassi, keeping a home private was not automatic. It required boundaries. It required saying no. It required accepting that some people would mistake privacy for mystery or even sadness. That is one of the risks of stepping away. When a famous woman does not constantly explain herself, the public often fills the silence. Is she unhappy? Is she hiding something? Did something happen? Sometimes the honest answer is less dramatic than the question. Sometimes a person simply wants a life that belongs to the people inside it. Still, there is something moving about the way Steffi's later years unfolded. She did not only become a wife and mother, she also continued the kind of work that had begun before her career was fully over. In 1998, in Hamburg, she established Children for Tomorrow, a foundation connected to helping children and families affected by war, persecution, and organized violence. That part of her life is important because it shifts the meaning of the story. Tennis had taught the world to count her greatness. 22 Grand Slam titles, weeks at #1, records, years finals. But the foundation points towards something that cannot be counted in the same clean way. How do you measure the value of helping a traumatized child feel safe? How do you rank a family that has survived violence? How do you put healing on a scoreboard? You can't. And maybe that is exactly why it matters. There is no stadium roar in that kind of work. No trophy ceremony, no headline that lasts for decades. It is quiet, difficult, human work. The kind that does not make a person look invincible, it makes them look aware. Aware that pain exists far beyond sport. Aware that winning cannot answer every question. Aware, perhaps, that a life built only around victory would become too small. I do not want to overstate this. We cannot pretend to know every private motivation behind what Steffi chose to support. But the pattern is there. Before she fully left tennis, she had already started building something outside tennis. That timing feels meaningful. It suggests that she was already looking beyond the court before the public was ready to see her anywhere else. And maybe that is where many people lost sight of her. Not because she vanished, because they kept looking for the champion while she was becoming someone else. If you are part of the generation that watched her in real time, this may feel personal. You may remember sitting in front of a television when tennis still felt slower, more formal, more distant. You may remember hearing her name spoken with a kind of certainty. Graf was not just a player. Graf was the answer to a question before the match even began. Then years passed. The sport changed. The players changed. The cameras changed. The world changed. And suddenly Steffi Graf was no longer the young woman from the old broadcasts. She was 57, softer in public, more private, less available, still recognizable, but not frozen in the frame where memory wanted to keep her. That is why seeing her now can make people emotional. It is not because she looks tragic, it is because time looks real. We are used to seeing stars preserved in highlights. A highlight reel does not age. It doesn't wake up tired. It doesn't choose silence. It does not have to raise children, lose people, protect a marriage, or learn how to live after the thing that once defined everything. But people do. Steffi did. And maybe the most difficult thing for an audience to accept is that the woman they remember from center court does not owe them constant access to the woman she is now. That sentence may sound simple. It is not. Because nostalgia can be loving, but it can also be selfish. We say we miss someone, but sometimes what we really miss is the feeling they gave us when we were younger. We miss the afternoon, the living room, the old television, the voice of a commentator, the sense that certain people would always be there, strong and unchanged. Steffi Graf reminds us that nobody remains unchanged, not even the ones who looked untouchable. So what happened to Steffi Graf at 57? The factual answer is calm. She is alive, she is private, she is still admired, she has a long marriage, a family, charitable work, and a place in tennis history that does not need defending. But the emotional answer is more complicated. She became harder to reach. She stopped belonging to the public in the way she once did. She allowed the old image to fade without fighting to replace it with a louder one. And maybe that is why people feel something close to grief when they see her now. Not grief for her death, not grief for some invented disaster, but grief for the distance between memory and reality. The girl with the forehand is gone. The woman remains. And the woman seems to have chosen peace over performance. There is no perfect conclusion here, no final sentence that explains everything neatly. Steffi Graf has never seemed interested in giving the world that kind of closure. Maybe she knows something the audience is still learning, that a person can be grateful for applause and still need silence, that a champion can love parts of the game and still leave it behind, that not every life after fame is a collapse. Sometimes it is a door closing gently, and behind that door, if we are honest, there may be nothing scandalous at all. Only a woman who gave the world her youth, her discipline, her excellence, and her name, and then quietly kept the rest for herself.